Morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along today. As always, we were kind of, we put off starting for a wee minute in the hope that more of our AT guests who'd signed up would actually turn up. But we're gonna start now, and I'm gonna do the really boring bit because I know there are just a handful of people here who are from outside the college. So it's a Wednesday. We do have a fire alarm test on a Wednesday. So if the alarm sounds, don't panic if we're not panicking, but watch for us. And when we start to panic, then we all need to leave by the nearest exit, which is just through the main barriers where you came in. And for those of you who don't know the building, there are loos everywhere. So if you come out of here and turn right and right again, you'll find some just the other side of the art shop, or left and left again, you'll find them just opposite the Airstream caravan. Okay. Should we talk about something a bit more interesting?
Yes. I'm going to be doing the introduction on our behalf. So I also wanted to say welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. Judy and I are delighted with the number of people that have shown interest in this symposium and the question of vulnerability and resistance. And also, I think we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. So thank you so much. For everybody, and thank you for the guests for attending today as well. I also wanted to thank our fund. We were funded for this, and we were initially funded by Central St. Martin's Knowledge Exchange funds for a symposium with 45 people, and then more and more people emailed Judy, who was dealing with all of that. And so it grew and grew. So we also would like to thank Tom Corby for research visibility funding, and also Judy's budget is helping us as well, so the museums and archives, so thank you. Today's symposium on vulnerability and resistance is part of a larger project that Judy and myself are working on entitled Creative Practices, Education and Wellbeing. So I'd like to begin by just introducing ourselves and our work, and then telling you a little bit about the project, and then a brief introduction to the theme of the symposium. So Judy Willcocks is head of museums and contemporary collections and senior research fellow at Central St. Martin's. She has worked at various institutions within museum and the education sector for her entire career, and has always been involved in supporting, developing, and championing socially engaged practice. I didn't run this by her, so I hope she approves. In her role at Central St. Martin's, she's been occupied with a series of activities that has seen her use her expertise in object-based learning to consider issues around well-being. For instance, Judy has worked with local communities and charities in the King Cross area to engage with social isolation within our elderly community. Judy has also been a core member of a very large HRC-funded project called Museums on Prescription that is based at UCL. Judy's research and writing focuses on art and design pedagogy, museums and archives, and well-being. And Judy has written several important reports on this topic, so policy reports, as well as publishing her own scholarly work in books and magazines such as Spark and the collection Engaging the Senses. A little bit about myself. So I've had a very long-term interest in contemporary art practice and psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic clinical practice. And I've recently published a book called Inside the Freud Museum's History, Memory, and Site-Responsive Art, as well as articles on clinical psychoanalytic practice, so ideas such as working through transference and use. And these can be found in Journal of Visual Culture, Journal of Visual Art Practice, and the book What is Research in the Visual Arts? My more immediate interest in mental health and well-being has come from my teaching here at Central St. Martin's and my engagement with students on the BA Fine Art, and being a PhD supervisor and convener of the doctoral platform at CSM. So it has been my experience with students who are dealing with mental health, ill health in their daily lives that has driven me to look more closely at this experience. And my new project is going to be on contemporary art, women's personal experience of mental ill health and psychotherapy. Okay, so that's Judy and I, and we kind of knew each other, from working at CSM together. However, we never had a proper conversation. So last summer, we spoke to one another, and our mutual interest of mental health and well-being emerged as something that we both shared and something that we wanted to work on together. We were very concerned with the rise of mental health issues in our student and staff body, and we quickly realized that we wanted to create a community of practice across UAL that would bring together staff and students to share our experiences, our practices, and what can and cannot be done to alleviate this burden that we are all probably experiencing and sharing in some way. And that was the beginning of Creative Practices Education and Wellbeing Project. Now, we were already aware of the fantastic work that members of staff across UAL were also doing already. So we really wanted to create a space in which we could all meet, showcase this work, and perhaps develop new projects together. Our main aim was to build a community of practice across UAL, and the next few years we're looking to deliver a series of events like this symposium, mapping event, writing, and finally we're looking to 2021 for a well-being space, to create a well-being space in the Letheby. And that was very much inspired by Lorraine Gammon and her team's The Making Space. We thought that was brilliant, and so we want to do something that has that kind of mobility and that kind of openness across the university and to people outside of the community, charities, and also other universities, that kind of thing. So we're wanting to do that in 2021. Our first event was a mapping event in March 2019, and that was our first attempt to bring people together across the university to talk about mental health, physical ill health, and well-being. And we were able to bring together 35 staff and a few students and a few external people as well. And we thought that was rather brilliant because we were able to bring together teachers, technicians, curators, artists, designers, members of the university, mental health team, counselors, and managers. So a lot of people at that event said, well, this is the first time that I've been in a room with all of these people, and that is really what we are wanting to do with the Creative Practices Education and Wellbeing Project. And there were three main themes that came out. I'm one slide behind. Three main themes that came up at that event: vulnerability, embodied experiences and the power of objects, challenging existing narratives of well-being, supporting staff to support students, and practical solutions. And we came out of that event really very, very elated, having had such a rich discussion amongst this wonderful and amazing group of staff and students and external people. And we thought that this idea of vulnerability is something that we wanted to focus on for our symposium. So the thinking around the symposium began in earnest then. So a little bit about today's symposium. Vulnerability and resistance. These two terms are often understood to be dichotomous, where vulnerability is traditionally understood as a deficit, an incapacity, a passivity which requires protection and paternalistic forms of power to deal with it. Resistance is often to be understood as a form of active negotiation, an activity that rises up and challenges certain forms of social, economic, and political frameworks, most often considered as injustices, social injustice or political and economic injustices. Where vulnerability seems to lack agency, resistance is a force of action precipitated by those with agency. Recently, the discourses around vulnerability and resistance have taken a turn. Where once the dichotomy was understood, as I've expressed it above, academics, activists, artists, and designers, along with mental and physical health workers, are coming to grips with what it would mean for us to break open this dichotomy. To see that there might be more to vulnerability than meets the eye. Perhaps vulnerability is not a deficit, but replete with possibilities. Possibilities for agency, power, and yes, resistance. This is not to dismiss forget, reject, or sidestep the real, lived experience of subjects who find ourselves negotiating mental ill health, incarceration, physical trauma, and illness. We also believe, and the discourses around resistance are attempting to reconsider what resistance can be and become. Perhaps we may wish to suggest that resistance may very well depend on a more complex understanding of vulnerable subjects, and with that, we may wish to rethink what vulnerability can offer us in terms of agency, power, and resistance, in light of the precarity, inequality, and increasing shift away from social care to individual responsibility that we see so very clearly in our culture. This may seem like a frighteningly grandiose proposal, and perhaps it is. But what if we were to bring together our individual and collective thinking and action in order to open up a space in which different discourses, alternative modalities of thinking and practice and living, where groups that rarely come together do so in order to talk, to listen, and participate in creating an alternative future. We hope that this space may very well open up to us today. And so let's proceed with our day in the hope and belief that we may very well begin to negotiate different ways of understanding vulnerability and resistance separately and together. So today we have 3 sessions. The first session is on autobiography, and we really wanted to think about what those who think about the way in which personal experience can be used as the basis to think about vulnerability and resistance, or rethink vulnerability and resistance. The second session today is on context, and that is looking at broader context. So we'll look at a history of the notion of vulnerability, but also the broader context, meaning higher education as well. So we have people coming in who have worked with students in various ways to think about vulnerability and resistance within higher education and our institution. And the last section is on activism, and we have brought together a group of speakers that are being are engaging with vulnerability and resistance in very practical ways, and are also getting out into the community and making a difference. So those are the sessions today. So I'm delighted that everybody is here to engage with this, and also that our speakers are here. So thank you. And Katerina Albano is going to be chairing our first session and also speaking later. So thank you.
Thank you, Judy and Joe, for organizing this fantastic day. And we shall start with our first speaker, who is John Miers. John is a former PhD student at Central St. Martin's. He did his PhD on visual metaphor and drone narratives, and completed in 2018, followed by a postdoctoral residency at the London College of Communication, of which was also completed in May. John is a lecturer in illustration and critical and historical studies at Kingston School of Art, and an associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's and the Royal College of Art. And today he's going to present a project he has been working on for a number of years, if I understand correctly, in speaking my truth through the voices of others.
Thank you, Katerina, and many thanks, Joe and Judy, for inviting me to take part in this. So let's just get this up. Okay, so in this session, this is going to be a workshop. In the second half of this session, I'm going to be inviting you all to make some drawings. This is something I'm aware that might be exciting to some of you and might be terrifying to others. But I have a lot of, as you can see, Judy's got them right there. I've got a lot of source material available and also tracing paper. So for people who are not confident with drawing, you can engage with this simply by tracing and making slight modifications to an image. Obviously, you're also very welcome to create new drawings yourself. So hopefully there won't be any kind of barriers to entry as far as this goes. So, there we go. Okay, yeah, so so what I'm going to do is spend about 20 minutes or so presenting the project that I recently, well, the first installment of the project that I, oh, that wasn't, oh, well, okay. Yes, so this was the main outcome from the residency that Katerina just mentioned. I should say, actually, this isn't a project that I have been working on for years, but it's a project I anticipate that I will be working on for the next few years. So I'll give a little bit of background to this, and then we'll give a bit more detail about my use of drawing. I'm going to focus on two particular kind of strategies of drawing, strategies in, oh, that's the wrong, sorry. So I just noticed that's the wrong title, but it is the correct presentation. Two ways of sort of adopting the voices, the visual voices of others, in order to both acknowledge vulnerability and generate resilience in the face of some, I guess trauma would be an appropriate word, some trauma that I myself have recently suffered. Okay, so the background. This project followed very directly on from my PhD, which, as Katerina said, was on the use of visual metaphor in drawn narratives. And the final chapter of my PhD was a case study of the graphic memoir Epileptic by the French cartoonist David B. Yeah, so this is the first page of the comic. Oh, and I should also say, shamelessly, I have a few copies of this with me. If anybody's interested, they're available to buy. Okay, so I won't read all of this out, but the salient point here is that in December of 2016, as described in the last panel there, I was diagnosed with primary progressive multiple sclerosis. I was writing this chapter in January and February of 2017, so this news was obviously very fresh, very raw to me at the time, and this was an acute coincidence of events in my personal life and aspects of my work as a researcher. So I was writing this case study of a graphic memoir in which a cartoonist makes extensive use of visual metaphor in order to process trauma that has been visited on his family by chronic disease, in this case epilepsy, while I myself was processing trauma that was brought about by the knowledge that I myself have a chronic disease. I didn't mention this in the thesis, but it seemed incredibly obvious that somehow bringing these together and making some work to try to work through this news had to be my next project. So I was very lucky to get this residency post at London College of Communication in the Archives and Special Collections Centre. There were a couple of aspects of the archives that I focused on, but a lot of the material I was looking at came from the Les Coleman collection. There we are, as promised. So Les Coleman was an artist, poet, and collector. He has, for anybody who's interested in comics or sort of underground publishing in general, he has the most wonderful collection of sort of underground and independent comics from the mostly American and European from the late 20th century. I focused in particular, One of the aspects of the archive that I spent a lot of time with was the archive of Lindsay Cooper, who was a composer and musician, primarily the bassoon, who herself had multiple sclerosis. And we've got her diaries there. But I've not really, a lot of that hasn't yet emerged as artwork. So what I'm going to focus on is the two strips that are in this comic, one of which responds to the work of Mark Bayer, one of which responds to the work of Ivan Brunetti. These are my drawings, not theirs. And broadly, what I would say is what I did with Mark Bayer was my sort of adoption of his visual voice was more about reproducing a particular type of affect that his work creates. Whereas in the case of Ivan Brunetti, this was more about drawing in a particular genre and using the expectations that that genre of drawing creates in order to be able to kind of reframe some of the more unpleasant aspects of multiple sclerosis. And yeah, as I say, in both of these strips, there is definitely an aspect of acknowledging and owning up to vulnerability, but the process of doing that, I would argue, has provided me with resilience in the face of coping with this disease. So when I started the project, I'm going to sort of talk through this work as it emerged fairly chronologically. My initial idea was that, well, basically what I would do would be to apply the methodologies I developed in my PhD to the work that is contained in the archive. And so what I'd imagined this would involve would be looking at the comics that were in there, looking at visual metaphors that other cartoonists had employed to express their own experiences of disability and illness, and then try to adopt those as suitable for my own experience. But what I found was quite quickly was that the archives just simply didn't contain the material that would support that kind of methodology. Because, well, basically there just isn't very much work in there by artists who've suffered any sort of significant physical illness or disability. But what I did find was that there was a lot of work where the metaphors go in the other direction. As in this example here from Ivan Brunetti, in which he's going through a dream sequence, and as a metaphor for his kind of crippling social anxiety, he depicts himself as his tormentors here say, defecating and urinating all over his sorry-ass self. Actually, having mentioned that, I should also put a bit of a warning. Some of the imagery in this strip might be a bit much for first thing in the morning. Let's put it that way. And this actually is entirely in keeping with the kind of metaphor theories that I was studying, because generally what we do with metaphor on a cognitive level is that we use concrete experiences to conceptualize abstract experiences. So in that sense, physical disability, let's say something like the mobility difficulties that are caused by multiple sclerosis, those are very concrete, whereas issues with mental health issues with anxiety, they're traditionally thought of as being more abstract. And what really struck me about this, so this is just a scribble of my experience while I was in the archives, was that this is pretty much a complete inversion of my own experience. So I'm fortunate in that I don't suffer from the kind of social anxiety that Brunetti describes here. On the other hand, unfortunately, to put it mildly, the kind of continence difficulties that he uses as a metaphor are a real symptom of multiple sclerosis and one of the aspects of the disease that has caused me most distress. And so the drawings that I started making in response to the work of Brunetti were almost more kind of oppositional, sort of working against what he was doing. So you can see in this first this is sort of the first complete drawing I made as part of the residency. So I pop up in this strip, and I'm like, "Oh, hey, Ivan Brunetti, why have you chosen to draw yourself lying in a pool of your own shit and piss?" And it's, oh, well, it's obviously a metaphor for how I see myself as a disgusting, pitiable loser. I'm not going to show the rest of that page, because that really is quite challenging. But this sort of producing this page was quite a breakthrough for me, and it suggested to me that this strategy of adopting the styles of others could this might seem like a paradox, but actually this might work very well as a way of allowing me to kind of drill down into some of the more intimate aspects of my own experience. So I mentioned that what I was doing with this work was more about kind of reproducing a genre and the expectations that come with that. So you might, even if you're not a comics fan, you may well recognize the pattern on Brunetti's shirt there. This is the T-shirt that is worn by Charlie Brown of Peanuts fame. So Brunetti is working very much in the underground comics tradition. I mean, this work was produced in the 1990s, so in a way this is already a pastiche of earlier underground artists like Robert Crumb. But what that first wave of underground artists did was to take the styles that we associate with things like Peanuts or with children's cartoons and to subvert them and to apply them to work that was, breaking political or sexual taboos. And so the use of this particular style of sort of drawings that look like they might be from a children's comic but are actually addressing material that is definitely not for children. This sort of creates this expectation that what you're going to get in this story is something that's possibly quite confronting, but something that's also going out of its way to be kind of humorous and entertaining. And so for me, this offered the possibility of telling a story about a time when I had suffered a continence issue, but rather than kind of wallowing in misery, actually turning it into kind of a gross-out scatological humour. And doing that felt quite empowering. But once I'd hit on that idea, I was like, yeah, I'm not quite ready to draw that yet. So actually this strip was produced much later in the residency. So I carried on looking at other work in the archives. I came across the work of Mark Beyer. Mark Beyer is, we could describe him as an outsider artist. Those of you who are familiar with outsider art will no doubt recognize some of the kind of features that we associate with that sort of work. His work was originally presented in the avant-garde anthology Raw in the 1970s. His work presents, this is sort of fairly typical in a way. These are his characters, Amy and Jordan. They exist in a world that is kind of nonsensically cruel. It's surreal, but it's also bleak. So in this world, if there's an ominous atmosphere hanging over the city, of course it's the result of the fact that an enormous leering skull has taken up residence on its outskirts. But I would argue that the kind of affect that we get from this comes not just from the situations that are presented in the comics, but from aspects of the drawing style. And perhaps in particular, well, if we focus on the composition, these kind of skewed, incoherent, exaggerated perspectives that run through Beyer's work might give us the same sort of feeling of dislocation that we get from something like de Chirico's Mystery and Melancholy of a Street. And both that and this kind of horror vacui desire to fill every space of the page with these obsessive-seeming patterns, that might put us in mind of the work of an artist like Madge Gill. This is another of his characters. I won't go through this strip in detail, but this kind of gives an idea of the sort of blank, affectless nature of this cruel universe. So this is Tony Target. He's leaving his house. He comes, oh, I feel so terrible. Oh, look, there's my neighbour lying on the floor. I wonder what's wrong with her. Oh, she's dead. I might as well just leave her here. Somebody will find her. People are always dying. What can you do? So this is obviously quite bleak stuff, but there's this, this surreality to it that does lend it also this sort of absurdist humour. As I said, I won't go through that strip in detail just for the sake of time. There were other things about Mark Beyer's work that I thought were useful, perhaps more direct connections to my own experience. His characters seem to spend a lot of time in hospital. They have a friend who suffers from chronic disease who they attempt unsuccessfully to comfort. Slightly more specifically, Tony Target's companion suffers from an immunological disease that means that her skin temperature can never rise above 70 degrees or she'll die. One of the symptoms of MS is that a thing called Uthof's phenomena is that actually if I get very hot, it brings on my symptoms more strongly than it otherwise would. So that was something that struck a chord with me. And so this is an example of the kind of use that I then went on to make with Bayer. And I've included this sketch as a means of sort of just indicating the kind of process I went through in order to analyze the drawing technique. And this is sort of to set up what I'll ask you to do in the workshop. So if you look at the drawing on the left, you'll notice that I've got little notes about specific details of production, dots all over the floor. At the top, it says lines across the wall. And so, as well as the composition, a large part of analyzing, this process of saying, oh, I'm going to use somebody else's drawing style, you might think, well, that sounds difficult, that sounds, I don't know, like a sophisticated thing to do, but you can break it down in quite simple ways. A lot of it is just looking at, well, on a mechanical level, what sort of marks are being made here? What sort of patterns are being used to fill out the world? And what kind of feeling do I get from those? And I think, so for example, the drawing on the right, it's a significant part of the affective power of that drawing does come from just this, this dots pattern here, which was fairly tedious to fill in, to be frank. But it's part of the feeling it produces, sort of having this overwhelming swirling of dots. This is a way of capturing the affect. Obviously, this is the moment when the diagnosis was confirmed, and I should also emphasize that no medical professional has spoken to me in anything like the callous manner that this doctor is here. But of course, this might not be literally true, but somebody's sitting in front of you telling you you've got an incurable degenerative disease. This is how it feels, even if that's not what is actually said. Yes, and I suppose, so more broadly, this I've mentioned this sort of sense of random cruelty that exists in Bayer's world, and that felt very appropriate to, well, you receive a piece of news like this, and to some extent, you're obviously just going to think, why me? And that why me feeling seems to be something that runs through Bayer's work and was useful for me to adopt. Actually, we'll skip on a little bit more. In terms of, so the title of this presentation, Speaking My Truth Through the Voices of Others. In general, I'm using voice in a metaphorical way. I'm talking about the visual voice. But there are aspects of this strip where voice is used a little more literally. So this is me about to go into an MRI scanner, and I'm thinking it's a good idea to do negative, destructive things to yourself. At least then people will pay some attention to you. This is from this is the only review that has been publicly posted of this comic so far. Una is a fellow cartoonist. She published a marvelous graphic memoir called Becoming Unbecoming, available on myriad editions. It's about surviving sexual abuse as a child, so it's very in keeping with the theme of this symposium. This was actually not written by her, but by her son. Her son is doing his A-levels and was unable to get the work experience placement that he wanted, so she employed him as an unpaid intern for a week for work experience. And one of the first tasks that she charged him with was to review my comic. And one of the comments he made was that the dialogue is blunt, awkward, and unfiltered. It feels like they're saying exactly what they're feeling. I'm glad that that's how it comes across, but it's not quite as simple as that. So this dialogue, I don't know if you can make that out, but those lines that I'm thinking there, they are actually lifted directly from one of Bayer's strips. These are words that his character Amy is thinking on one of her visits to hospital. And I'm using this in a way kind of ironically. Obviously, I don't for a moment think that having MS is something that I've done to myself. But this sort of, at least then people will pay some attention to you. Well, here I am with people paying attention to me while I talk about it. I've been fortunate to have numerous invitations. Yesterday I was at a conference in Manchester presenting about the same project. And I've joked sometimes that actually having MS seems to have been quite good for my career so far. So I'm sort of getting at that there. But there are other aspects where this act of ventriloquism allowed me to express thoughts sort of very openly in a way that almost might otherwise have seemed cliched. So here, this is a double-page spread where I go into the MRI scanner. And down here, I have thoughts that somehow can't be encompassed inside my mind. I still want to do so many things with my life. I don't want to just give up. Now, those are, in particular, these last two sentences, those clearly are things that I feel very strongly. This is absolutely true. But once again, they're not actually my words. Here they are at the bottom left, being spoken by Amy again, one of Bayer's characters. And it's almost like, this thing of, I still want to do all these things with my life, I don't want to give up. Of course it's true, but it's so obviously true that it's a cliche. And I think that if I'd sort of scripted this as myself, I don't know if I would have put something like this in, because I don't know how I would have got around it seeming cliched. But engaging in this act of ventriloquism, sort of doing it with this voice of another person, sort of revitalized the cliche, kind of re-emphasized the personal truth that it has for me. And so, so in a way, speaking my truth through the voice of others, in this sense, allowed this sort of blunter presentation of what I consider my truth to be. Okay, so just quickly a few more comments on Brunetti, and then we'll move on to the workshop session. Having got stuck into the Bayer stuff a bit more and sort of worked myself up to it, I was like, okay, I'm ready to start drawing this other strip. So the event that I depict here is, well, I won't beat around the bush. One morning, on the way to work, it happened to be my first day of work at the Royal College of Art. So it was, I was very pleased to be doing this, obviously. I was on my way to deliver a workshop using ideas that emerged directly from my thesis. So I was feeling pretty pleased with myself. And then I shat myself on the way. That was not pleasant. It was probably one of the, I don't think anybody, well, obviously I've told lots of people about it now, but I don't think anybody knew about it at the time. It was probably one of the most humiliating experiences of my life, if not the most. So here I am walking along. I've left the tube at White City. I went the wrong way out the tube. Turn around, I realise I'm panicking at this point. I already know that I'm going to be late and make a bad impression. Obviously, I end up making a worse impression by having to disappear to the toilet for 10 minutes to get cleaned up as soon as I arrive. So here, I'm walking along. It's going to be fine. Don't think about it. Just concentrate on walking. Maybe it's just wind. I could try to slip a fart out. No, too risky. Just clench. And then you turn the page and this happens. And this was my reaction. As I said, these genre markers. So this looks like a page from an underground comic. This isn't how I usually draw. There are many features here. All of this stippling at the back, the hatching around the face. These aren't things that I normally do in my own cartooning. These are features that I've picked up directly from Brunetti. And again, in the same way as I mentioned with Bayer, they've come very directly just by looking in detail at what kind of mark making is he using and how can I apply that myself. And it's like, okay, so, right, he'll do a bunch of hatching around the edge of a face. Right, I'll do that. And these things create these signifiers that let us know, right, we're in this particular space. We're in this particular space where we're going to get gross out scatological humour. And for me, it's almost like sort of saying back to the disease, okay, you're going to make me go through this stuff? All right, well, I'm going to flip it around, and I'm going to laugh at it, and I'm going to put it out there so other people can laugh at it. And for me, that feels very empowering. Yeah, I think... yeah, actually, that's probably all I want to say about the projects themselves. Thank you for listening. So, so I think we've got just over half an hour, according to the timer on there, to do the workshop bit. So, yeah, there are two things that I'd like you to do. So you've got these handouts going around. So there are about 8 pages of comics drawings there, some from Brunetti, some from Beyer. They're all from artists who are represented in the Les Coleman collection. So it's all stuff that I used in some way in the research process. You've also got tracing paper, and I think we have just regular paper as well. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to try to use these to create a self-portrait in which, obviously, I hope that nobody here has suffered any severe trauma in the last few weeks, but to use these to create a self-portrait that tries to capture a feeling of stress or frustration or distress that you've experienced in the recent past. And there are 2 aspects to this. So on the one hand, we've got the creation of character. Now, that's not really something that I spoke about very much, but you could obviously see that in those 2 comics, on the one hand, I'd kind of caricatured myself, as I have done here, and on the other hand, I'd created this, this version of myself that doesn't look like me at all, but takes on Bayer's style. So if you could look through those and perhaps pick, it could be one character, or maybe there are a couple of characters who might represent different aspects of things that you felt recently. And as I say, so depending on how comfortable you feel with drawing, you can either get a piece of tracing paper and just trace over a chosen character, and obviously feel free to make any modifications that you might want to make in order to personalize that character. So maybe you'll want to give the character an accessory that feels like an accessory that belongs to you, or maybe you'll want to change the expression or change the hairstyle or something like that. Or, of course, if you feel confident in doing so, just take a regular piece of paper and kind of do your own self-portrait in response. Sorry. It's coming around. Okay, so that's that's part 1. Once you've done that, I would well, it's entirely up to you what you do, really. But what I was thinking might work well would be, first of all, having done the character, to then think about sort of a setting or background. Now, this could be a realistic or convincing 3-dimensional space. This could just be a bunch of abstract patterns. So, as I've tried to emphasize in my talk, a large part of my response to the work that I was using came from just looking at the patterns of mark making, the patterns of tone that these artists have employed, and trying to adopt the feelings that these patterns of mark making and tone might give me. So once you've got your kind of, your modified self-portrait, or whatever that might be, then have a look for more abstract elements, such as, textures or line junctions that suggest particular perspectives. And again, you can use the tracing paper to grab elements of those, equally carry on the regular paper. Again, this just depends on what you're comfortable with. So that hopefully in about, say, 20 minutes' time, you'll have a picture that shows, that sort of enacts you dealing with something that you've dealt with recently. And then, if you could try and spend, say, 20 minutes on that, and then I'd like to use the last 10 minutes of this session for discussion. So not in any particularly formal way, but I just think it's nice to see what other people are doing. So once you've done it, perhaps if you just turn to somebody who's sitting nearby you and spend a few minutes explaining to one another, okay, this is what I've drawn, this is what it expresses for me, these are the bits I've chosen, and this is why I chose them. And that is it. Are there any questions? Does any of that require clarification? Yes? Yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's, I mean, I think the starting point is think of, I mean, it might not be a particular moment, it might be something that extends over a period of days, but, think of an experience that you've had recently, where you felt like you had to cope with something. This could have been a moment of stress or distress, whatever it might be, whether it's physical, mental, work-related, but sort of use that as your initial key. So when you're looking through the images, when you're looking at the faces, the characters, the patterns, try to look for things that might be useful in coming up with a visual expression of that.
Can I just ask anybody who needs a drawing pen, you just stick their hand up so I know where to go? Yes, I'll come back to this bit. Anybody else?
There's one at the back over there. Everyone, we're just going to move things on slightly quicker than I'd said, because it's 11 already. But I mean, from what I've seen over here, it looks like people got really stuck into this already, which is fantastic. So, well, when you feel ready, but in the if you might want to perhaps turn to somebody sitting close to you and start getting a little bit of discussion going on for the last few minutes of this session, just to talk about which image you chose, why you chose it, what it represents to you, and then I think it'll be time for the break. Tea is now served. So thank you so much for listening and for engaging. Obviously I didn't speak to everybody, but what I've seen is just fantastic. Looks like you really did make use of that in the way that I'd hoped. So thank you very much.